Everyone's seen a photograph of a supply depot, rows of crates, organized stacks, trucks moving in and out on clean roads, with signs pointing to the next checkpoint. Neat, controlled, logical. That's what most people picture when they hear the words ammunition supply point. But that image has nothing to do with what actually happened in Europe between 1944 and 1945. The real story of Allied ammunition logistics is one of the most brutal, chaotic, and strangely invisible chapters of the entire war. Invisible because it happened behind the front lines, mostly. Invisible because it involved men whose names never made the headlines. Invisible because nobody writes songs about the guy who spent 17 hours driving a deuce-and-a-half loaded with artillery shells down a bombed-out road while German fighters swept the area. But here's the thing. Without those men, without those trucks, without those impossible decisions about where to move thousands of tons of shells, propellant, and fuses, while artillery was landing close enough to shake the ground, the war in Europe doesn't end the way it does. The offensives stall, the guns go silent, and the soldiers at the sharp end of the line, the ones everyone does remember, they stop advancing and start dying in place. If you've never thought seriously about how an army feeds its guns, you're about to. Because the Allied ammunition supply system in the European theater wasn't just a logistical function. It was a living organism under permanent stress, constantly threatened, constantly adapting, and constantly making decisions that sound insane from the outside, but were in fact the only rational choices available. And a big part of that story is movement. Specifically, why supply points couldn't stay still. Why the moment you thought you had a safe, solid, well-stocked ammunition dump in a good location, everything changed, and you had to move it again. Sometimes miles, sometimes just a few hundred yards, sometimes in the middle of the night with shells landing in the next field. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this, because we're just getting started. To understand why Allied ammunition supply points had to move constantly, you first have to understand the sheer scale of what a modern army eats in a single day of serious combat. The numbers are genuinely hard to wrap your mind around. During the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, a single American corps operating in active offensive operations could fire tens of thousands of artillery rounds in a day, not counting small arms, not counting mortar ammunition, not counting anti-tank rounds, anti-aircraft shells, aircraft bombs, or the hundreds of other categories of ammunition that had to flow continuously from the beaches and ports in the rear all the way to the gun lines at the front. The British and Canadian armies had similar appetites. The Germans certainly did. And every single one of those shells had to be manufactured, packed, shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded, stored, sorted, transported, and delivered to the exact gun or the exact unit that needed it, at the exact time they needed it, in the exact quantity required to maintain fire. Fall short on any one of those steps, and the guns go quiet. And quiet guns in offensive operations don't just mean a pause. They mean infantry moving forward without suppression, which means they get cut down. The logistics chain that made all of this possible had several layers, and understanding those layers explains why movement was built into the system from the beginning. At the far end were the base depots, massive storage installations near the major ports, Cherbourg, Antwerp, later Marseille. These held enormous quantities of everything, and they were relatively stable because they were far enough from the front that enemy action was not an immediate daily concern. Although Antwerp, as we'll get to, was a very different story. Below the base depots were the army-level dumps, large enough to hold several days of consumption for a whole army. Below those were corps-level supply points, smaller, more mobile, positioned closer to the fighting. And below those, the division and regimental ammunition supply points, sometimes just a scattering of pallets under camouflage netting in a field, a few trucks parked around the edges, men working through the night to break down bulk loads into what each battery needed for the next 24 hours. The further forward you got, the smaller the stockpile, the shorter the time horizon, and the more dangerous the ground. And every one of these installations, from the core dump to the forward ASP in a field, had to move whenever the tactical situation demanded it, which was constantly. Let's talk about why movement was so frequent. Because there were multiple drivers and they didn't all work in the same direction. Sometimes you moved because you were advancing and the dump was too far back. Sometimes you moved because the front shifted and now your position was no longer safe. Sometimes you moved because enemy air or artillery had found you. Sometimes you moved because the road network changed, a bridge went out, A town became contested, a route flooded in autumn rain. And sometimes you moved for reasons that were purely bureaucratic, a boundary change between adjacent corps, a new axis of advance that made your current position irrelevant to the units you were supposed to serve. Every one of these triggers was real. Every one of them could force the movement of thousands of tons of ammunition, with very little warning, and in conditions that were rarely anything close to ideal. Let's start with the most dramatic driver: enemy fire. The moment an ammunition supply point was identified by the enemy, it became a priority target. And identification was easier than it sounds. Ammunition dumps are hard to hide completely. Trucks move in and out constantly. The ammunition itself requires specific handling, so the areas look different from the air than ordinary farmland or woodland. Camouflage helped, but it wasn't perfect. Artillery survey teams on the German side were good at their jobs. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, though increasingly rare as 1944 wore on, could still photograph areas and identify concentrations of vehicles and materiel. And once a supply point was identified, the Germans had every incentive to hit it hard. A well-placed artillery strike or bombing run on a major ammunition dump didn't just destroy supplies. It created a catastrophic secondary explosion that could wipe out the entire stock in one enormous fireball and kill or wound every man within a significant radius. This wasn't a theoretical risk. It happened. And the threat of it happening shaped every decision about where to locate supply points, how long to stay there, and when to move. The procedure for selecting an ammunition supply point location balanced multiple competing demands. You needed to be close enough to the front that forward units could get resupplied quickly. You needed adequate road access so incoming trucks from the rear could reach you without bottlenecks. You needed space, physical space, because ammunition storage doctrine required dispersal. You didn't pile everything together in one heap because one hit would wipe everything out. You spread it out. Pallets separated by distance, different categories of ammunition in different sub-areas, with earth berms or natural features providing some protection between them. You needed cover from aerial observation, trees, buildings, terrain features, and you needed to be not so obviously on a major axis of advance that the enemy could predict your presence from a map. Finding a piece of ground that ticked all those boxes, in the middle of a moving campaign, often in terrain you'd never seen before, sometimes in the dark, always under time pressure, was a job that fell to logistics officers who had to make decisions with incomplete information and live with the results. When a supply point had to move under fire, or with fire clearly incoming, the situation became a controlled crisis. And the word controlled is doing a lot of work there. The priority was simple in theory and nightmarish in practice. Get the ammunition out before it gets hit. Because a supply point that gets destroyed doesn't just mean that ammunition is gone. It means the units that depend on it will run short. It means the supply chain has to scramble to push forward replacement stocks that haven't arrived yet. It means there's a gap, and gaps in ammunition supply during offensive operations have consequences that cascade all the way to the front line. So you move. You load what you can, as fast as you can, in whatever trucks are available, and you get it down the road. You abandon what you can't carry if the situation is desperate enough. You accept that some of what you worked so hard to stockpile is going to be left behind, possibly to be destroyed by your own engineers, so it doesn't fall into enemy hands. And then you find a new location and start again. The Battle of Normandy provides some of the clearest early examples of these dynamics at work. The Allied lodgement area in the weeks after D-Day was small and crowded. Thousands of tons of supplies were flowing in over the beaches and through the gradually expanding port facilities, but the front lines were close. The Germans were fighting hard to contain the beachhead, and there was almost no depth to work with. Ammunition supply points were established wherever space could be found, sometimes in orchards, sometimes in fields, sometimes along roadsides with vehicles backed into hedges for concealment. And they were under periodic artillery and mortar fire almost from the beginning. German gunners knew roughly where the beaches were. They knew supplies had to be somewhere behind the front. They fired harassing missions into areas they suspected held dumps. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they were uncomfortably right. Logistics units learned quickly that you didn't advertise your location. You minimized vehicle movement during daylight. You used routes that offered cover. You dispersed as widely as the local terrain allowed. And you always had a plan for moving. Not eventually, now. because the call to relocate could come with almost no warning, and if you weren't ready, you'd be scrambling to move while rounds were landing. The men who ran these supply points developed a kind of operational paranoia that was actually adaptive. They looked at their position constantly, asking themselves where the nearest cover was, which direction gave the best exit route, how long it would take to load the trucks, which items were most critical, and had to move first. This wasn't anxiety, it was professional survival. The hedgerow country of Normandy added a layer of specific misery to all of this. The bocage, that dense network of ancient earthen banks, topped with thick vegetation that divided the Norman landscape into tiny fields, was simultaneously a blessing and a curse for logistics. On the blessing side, it provided concealment. Ammunition stored in the lee of a bocage bank was hard to see from the air, protected somewhat from the blast of near misses, and naturally dispersed by the irregular field pattern. On the curse side, it made movement agonizingly slow. Roads through bocage country were narrow, winding, and often barely passable for heavy trucks loaded with ammunition. When you needed to move a supply point in a hurry, the bocage could slow that movement to a crawl, and every minute you spent on the road with a truck full of high explosive was a minute when a strafing run or an artillery round could turn a logistical problem into a catastrophe. The breakout from Normandy, in late July 1944, Operation Cobra, changed the logistical picture dramatically and created its own set of challenges. Once the front began moving fast, the supply system had to keep up with an advance that sometimes covered miles in a single day. Ammunition supply points that had been carefully positioned for a static front suddenly found themselves too far back to serve the rapidly advancing spearheads. The solution was continuous forward displacement. Leapfrogging. You'd move a portion of the supply point forward to a new location while the old location kept operating, then shift more forward as the advance continued. This required careful coordination, adequate transport, and good communications. Sometimes all three were available. Often one or more was lacking, and the pressure never let up, because the troops at the front weren't going to slow down to wait for the supply system to catch up. They couldn't afford to. The speed of the pursuit across France in August 1944 created what historians of logistics call the administrative crisis. Though crisis almost undersells it, the Allied armies were advancing so fast that the supply system, built for a more methodical campaign, couldn't keep pace. Fuel was the most famous shortage of this period, the one that gets discussed most often because it contributed directly to the debates between Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Patton about strategic priorities. But ammunition was also in short supply at times, and for the same fundamental reason. The distance from the supply base to the front was growing faster than the transport capacity available to cover it. Every ton of ammunition had to travel further, every truck had to make longer round trips. And there weren't enough trucks, there were never enough trucks, to cover the growing gap between where the supplies were and where they were needed. This is the moment to talk about trucks. Because the truck is the central character in this story, in a way that almost no other piece of equipment is. The American 2.5-ton truck, universally called the Deuce and a Half, was the workhorse of Allied logistics. The British had their equivalent. Both armies relied on motor transport in a way that had no precedent in military history. Moving ammunition from supply point to supply point, from corps dumps to division dumps to forward ASPs, required thousands of trucks making continuous round trips on roads that were often damaged, congested, muddy, and under fire. Drivers worked in shifts around the clock. Trucks broke down and were repaired on the roadside. Routes became clogged when multiple units were trying to use the same road at the same time, which happened constantly. Traffic control became a major military function in its own right, with MPs at key intersections directing vehicles and trying to prevent the logistical gridlock that threatened to paralyze the whole system. The Red Ball Express is the most famous example of what Allied truck logistics looked like at its most extreme. Established in late August 1944 to deal with the supply crisis caused by the rapid advance, Red Ball was essentially a one-way loop road system dedicated entirely to keeping supplies moving to the front. Trucks ran day and night, loaded with fuel, food, and ammunition. Maintenance was done on the move or during brief stops. Drivers pushed themselves and their vehicles beyond normal limits. The system worked, after a fashion, but it consumed trucks and drivers at a punishing rate and still couldn't fully close the supply gap. What the Red Ball Express shows, more than anything, is how desperate the situation became when the front moved faster than the supply system was designed to handle. And that desperation had direct consequences for ammunition supply points, which were having to operate under conditions of genuine scarcity, while simultaneously managing the tactical problems of location, security, and movement. The autumn of 1944 brought a change of pace that created a different but equally difficult set of problems. The rapid advance slowed as supply shortages bit and as German resistance stiffened along the borders of the Reich. The front began to stabilize, at least relatively, and the logistical situation improved somewhat as the supply base was extended and the lines of communication were reorganized. But stabilization didn't mean safety for ammunition supply points. In some ways, it made the situation worse, because when the front isn't moving, the enemy has time to study your positions, improve their observation, and target your rear areas more systematically. German artillery in this period, though reduced from its peak, was still effective and still looking for high-value targets. An ammunition supply point was about as high value as it got. The city of Antwerp becomes central to the story here. Antwerp's port, captured largely intact in September 1944, was the logistical lifeline the Allies desperately needed. A major deep-water port, capable of handling the tonnage required to sustain a massive army, it transformed the supply situation in the fall and winter. But the Germans recognized its importance immediately and responded with their most sustained campaign of V-weapon attacks since the flying bomb offensive against London. Antwerp was struck by hundreds of V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles between October 1944 and March 1945. The intent was to destroy, or at least disrupt, the port and the supply infrastructure built around it. The V-2, which arrived without warning and couldn't be intercepted, was particularly terrifying. You couldn't hear it coming. The first indication that one was inbound was the explosion. Civilian casualties in the city were horrific. Military and logistical facilities in and around the port were hit repeatedly. This created a situation where supply installations in the Antwerp area had to manage a permanent threat that was, by its nature, impossible to predict or defend against. You couldn't move the port, you couldn't relocate the docks, but you could, and had to, think very carefully about where you stored things in relation to those docks, how much you stockpiled in any one location, and how quickly you could move material out of the danger zone and further forward. The dispersal that was standard practice anyway became even more critical here, because the randomness of V-weapon impact meant that any concentration of supplies near Antwerp was at risk. Logistical planners had to balance the efficiency argument, which said keep things close to the unloading point, against the survival argument, which said spread things out and get them away from the target area as fast as possible. In practice, both arguments won, which meant a constant flow of material out of the port and into the dispersed supply chain further east, even as more material was flowing in from the ships. Winter arrived and brought its own misery to the logistical world. The ground that had been a tactical problem in autumn, muddy and soft after the rains, now froze. Roads iced over. Vehicles struggled in conditions that tested equipment and men alike. Moving ammunition in a European winter, at night, on icy roads, in blacked-out conditions because you didn't dare show lights and invite air attack, was a level of difficulty that's hard to convey without actually experiencing it. Trucks slid off roads. Loads shifted and had to be resecured. Men handling metal ammunition crates in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate gloves got frostbitten fingers. The physical labor of stacking and unstacking hundreds of heavy shells in freezing conditions, under time pressure, sometimes while artillery was audible in the distance, was the unglamorous reality of keeping the guns fed. Then came the Ardennes. The German offensive that began on December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, was many things simultaneously. It was a desperate gamble by Hitler to split the Allied front and capture Antwerp. It was a tactical shock that achieved genuine surprise. It was a crisis that tested every layer of the Allied military system. And for ammunition logistics, it was an emergency that required exactly the kind of rapid, chaotic movement that the supply system was designed to handle, but always struggled with in practice. When the German offensive punched through the thinly held American lines in the Eifel and began expanding westward, the supply installations in that sector faced an immediate and concrete threat. Not just German artillery and air attack, but German ground forces. Ammunition supply points that were safely behind the front on December 15th were suddenly in danger of being overrun on December 16th or 17th. The orders went out quickly. Move. Destroy what you can't move. Don't let it fall into German hands. The destruction of supplies that couldn't be evacuated was carried out in some areas with whatever means were available, sometimes by engineers with demolition charges, sometimes by setting fire to stores, sometimes by simply pushing vehicles off roads into ditches and moving. The loss of supplies in the initial days of the Bulge was significant. But what's less often recognized is how much was successfully evacuated. Logistics units that had internalized the principle of always being ready to move did move, quickly, with what they could carry, falling back to new positions, while the tactical picture remained desperately unclear. The ammunition that they saved, the stocks that were successfully relocated away from the German advance, became critically important in the days that followed, as American forces organized their defense, and the massive Allied counterattack began to take shape. Bastogne is the famous point of resistance in the Bulge story. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units holding the town against German encirclement became the symbol of American stubbornness in the crisis. An ammunition supply is central to the Bastogne story, in a way that isn't always given its proper weight. The defenders of Bastogne were running short on ammunition, especially artillery ammunition, within days of the encirclement. The artillery that had been available when the siege began was being consumed at rates that the initial stocks couldn't sustain indefinitely. The supply situation was one of the primary reasons the situation was so precarious. And it was only when the weather cleared enough for aerial resupply that the immediate crisis was addressed, with C-47s dropping bundles of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition into the Bastogne perimeter. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient. Resupply by air is always a fraction as effective as resupply by road, but it was what was possible under the circumstances, and it helped the garrison hold until Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. The successful containment and then defeat of the Ardennes offensive required a massive redeployment of Allied forces and, with them, their logistical support. Ammunition supply points that had been set up to support operations in one direction suddenly had to support operations in another. Units that had been in quiet sectors were rushed to the Bulge. Their supply arrangements had to follow. This meant more movement, more reorganization, more decisions made quickly by officers working from incomplete maps in cold, dark conditions. The strain on the logistics system in December 1944 and January 1945 was enormous. That it held, that the guns never went completely silent, that the counterattack could be mounted and sustained, was a testament to the system's resilience and to the competence and toughness of the men who ran it. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 represents another inflection point for ammunition supply. Getting across the Rhine required careful preparation. Artillery would play a massive role in supporting the crossings, both in suppressing German defenses on the far bank and in beating back German counterattacks once bridgeheads were established. This meant that ammunition supply points had to be positioned to support very high rates of artillery fire in a relatively concentrated area, and then shift quickly to support exploitation as the bridgeheads expanded. The fire plan for Operation Plunder, the British and Canadian crossing at Wesel, involved enormous quantities of artillery ammunition fired over a relatively short period. Getting that ammunition forward, maintaining the supply chain through the chaos of a major river crossing operation, with all the traffic and congestion and engineer activity that came with it, was a serious test of the supply system, and the supply system passed. Once across the Rhine, the pace of advance accelerated again, and the familiar pattern reasserted itself. Ammunition supply points had to move frequently, sometimes daily, to keep up with advancing divisions. The Germans were falling back, often quickly, but they weren't giving up. Rearguard actions, defended towns, occasional sharp counterattacks, all of these required that artillery support remain available, which meant ammunition supply had to keep up. The roads in Germany in the spring of 1945 were generally better than the roads in France or Belgium, which helped. German infrastructure, though damaged by Allied bombing, was still substantially intact in many areas, but the distances were still growing, and the challenges of moving supply points quickly while maintaining coverage of the advancing front were still real. The men who did this work rarely get named in the histories. The logistics units, the quartermaster corps, the ordnance companies, the truck companies that formed the backbone of the supply system, They don't have the kind of individual heroism stories that make it into popular accounts. Their heroism was collective and institutional. It showed up in maintenance rates and tonnage delivered, and round trips completed, and supply points relocated without catastrophic incident. It showed up in the decision made by a supply point commander at 2 in the morning to load half the stock and move it down the road because something felt wrong about the incoming fire, and then watching the old position take a direct hit at 3. It showed up in the drivers who made the same run for the 37th time and still managed to stay alert enough to avoid the crater that had opened up in the road since their last trip. This was the daily texture of ammunition logistics in the European theater. There's a dimension to this story that gets almost no attention, and that's the human cost of ammunition handling itself, separate from enemy action. Working with large quantities of high explosive in field conditions was inherently dangerous. Accidents happened. Shells were fused incorrectly. Handling procedures were violated under pressure. Vehicles carrying ammunition were involved in accidents on damaged roads. Occasionally, through some combination of factors that investigators were never fully able to reconstruct, stored ammunition detonated without any enemy involvement. The explosions were as devastating as anything the enemy could produce. The men who worked with ammunition every day lived with this risk as part of their professional reality. They followed the handling procedures not because someone was watching, but because they understood what the alternative looked like. Safety in an ammunition supply point wasn't a bureaucratic formality. It was survival. Let's talk about fuses, because fuses represent one of the most underappreciated complexities in the whole ammunition supply picture. A shell without a fuse is inert. It's heavy metal. It's not going to explode no matter how many times you drop it. But a shell with a fuse installed, particularly certain types of fuses, is significantly more sensitive. Different artillery pieces fired different types of shells with different fusing requirements. Anti-tank rounds had their own fusing characteristics. Anti-personnel rounds, high-explosive rounds, smoke rounds, illumination rounds, armor-piercing rounds, all of these had specific fusing requirements, and fuses had to be matched to shells, shells had to be matched to propellant charges, and the whole package had to be assembled correctly to produce the result the gunner expected. Managing this at scale, in a forward supply point under pressure, was a genuine technical challenge. Getting it wrong could mean a shell that failed to function when it was desperately needed, or worse, a premature detonation. The technical competence of the ordnance and quartermaster units that handled ammunition in the European theater was a genuine military capability, unglamorous but essential. The British and Canadian armies had their own ammunition supply systems that ran in parallel with the American system and had their own institutional traditions and challenges. The Royal Army Service Corps handled logistics in the British military framework, and the Canadian Army had its equivalent. The doctrine was broadly similar. The challenges were familiar, but the specific equipment, the supply chain structure, and the operational contexts were somewhat different. The British had their own truck fleets, their own depot organizations, their own forward supply point procedures, and they faced many of the same basic problems, which shouldn't surprise anyone, because those problems were generated by the physics of artillery consumption and the geography of northwestern Europe, not by any specific national army's choices. The Canadian operations in the Scheldt estuary in the fall of 1944 provide a particularly harsh example of what ammunition supply in difficult terrain looked like. The objective was clearing the approaches to Antwerp, specifically the islands and flooded polders that guarded the Scheldt. The ground was amphibious in the most literal sense. Large parts of the operational area were flooded by German deliberate inundation. Roads were limited and frequently under fire. Moving ammunition to support the infantry in this environment required improvisation on a scale that exceeded almost anything else in the campaign. Ducks, the amphibious trucks formerly known as Duku, became critical here. Boats were used. Wherever solid ground could be found, it was used as a supply point, even if solid ground meant a strip of road embankment 50 meters wide with water on both sides. Artillery pieces were sometimes positioned in conditions that made normal ammunition supply procedures impossible, and the supply teams had to adapt in real time. The Scheldt campaign was won, but the logistical cost, measured in effort and improvisation and sheer physical difficulty, was immense. Artillery itself deserves a moment of attention as a system, because the character of the guns determined the character of the ammunition supply problem. The Allies used a range of artillery pieces in the European campaign. The American 105mm howitzer was the standard light artillery piece, versatile and widely deployed. The 155mm howitzer, both towed and self-propelled, provided heavier fire support. The 155mm long tom gun fired longer ranges and was used for counter-battery work and interdiction. Heavier pieces, including 203mm howitzers and 240mm guns, were available for particularly demanding targets. The British had their own equivalents: the 25-pounder as the standard light piece, the 5.5-inch gun howitzer as medium artillery, and heavier pieces for special tasks. Each of these weapons had a different rate of fire capability, a different ammunition weight, and a different logistical footprint. The 105mm round was manageable by a single man. The 240mm round required mechanical handling. Planning an ammunition supply point to serve a mixed artillery brigade meant managing a catalog of different rounds, different propellant charges, different fuses, and different delivery schedules simultaneously. Counter-battery fire, the practice of using your own artillery to silence enemy guns, was particularly ammunition-intensive because it required sustained firing to suppress or destroy enemy pieces that were themselves trying to avoid destruction by displacing. When Allied artillery was engaged in serious counter-battery operations, consumption rates could spike dramatically, and the supply system had to anticipate those spikes and have the rounds forward in time to meet them. Failing to do so meant that enemy guns survived, kept firing, and kept killing Allied soldiers. This created a demanding planning environment, where ammunition supply officers had to work closely with artillery planners, understand the intended fire plans, and position stocks accordingly. It was a tight feedback loop, and it had to function correctly even in chaotic conditions. The signal communications that made all of this coordination possible also had to move when supply points moved. Radio sets, telephone wire, signal teams, all of these had to come along and be re-established at the new location so that the supply point could continue to receive requests, report stocks, and coordinate with the units it supported. In the best case, this happened smoothly, and there was only a brief interruption in communications during the actual move. In practice, it was often messier. Wire lines ran forward to the gun lines and had to be rerouted when the supply point moved. Radio nets had to be re-established, with updated frequencies and call signs. Liaison officers had to be informed of the new location so they could guide their unit's vehicles to the right place. All of this was coordination overhead that added to the burden of movement and made rapid relocation even more challenging than it sounds. Weather wasn't just a physical challenge, it was also an intelligence challenge. Low cloud and fog that grounded Allied aircraft also grounded Allied reconnaissance, making it harder to track German movements and harder to anticipate where enemy artillery might shift its fire. The uncertainty this created fed directly into the decision-making around supply point placement and timing of movements. If you couldn't be sure where the German front line was, if you couldn't be sure whether that apparently quiet stretch of road was actually clear of enemy forces, every movement decision became more fraught. Commanders of supply points had to make judgments about risk under genuine uncertainty, sometimes hourly, with the knowledge that being wrong could get their men killed and their supplies destroyed. The German use of Nebelwerfer rocket artillery, popularly nicknamed Moaning Minis by Allied troops for the sound of their incoming rounds, represented a specific threat to supply installations. These weapons fired multiple rockets in rapid succession and covered a larger area than a single artillery piece. They were mobile and could be emplaced quickly, fired their full load, and displaced before Allied counter-battery could respond effectively. A Nebelwerfer salvo into a supply point didn't have to score direct hits to cause serious problems. Fragments and blast could kill men, damage vehicles, and in the worst case, initiate fires in stored ammunition. The psychological effect was also real. The distinctive sound of incoming Nebelwerfer rockets was one of the most unnerving things on the Western Front, and men working in supply points who heard that sound had very little time to react before the rounds arrived. The need to maintain overhead cover, whatever was available, became even more apparent in areas where Nebelwerfers were active. The liberation of Paris created an unexpected logistical distraction in the broader supply story. The city required immediate humanitarian assistance: food, fuel, and medical supplies. none of which had been factored into the planning for the operational supply chain. Feeding Paris came at a cost to the military supply effort, diverting transport that was already desperately stretched. Eisenhower and his staff recognized this as a problem, but understood that allowing Paris to starve or collapse into chaos was politically and morally unacceptable. The decision was made to feed the city, accept the transportation cost, and compensate elsewhere in the supply system. It's a reminder that military logistics doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a political and human context that sometimes imposes demands that have nothing to do with military efficiency. The role of railway transport in the ammunition supply chain is crucial and often overlooked in narratives that focus on trucks. Railways could move far larger quantities of ammunition than trucks, and they were essential for the deeper parts of the supply chain, moving stocks from the ports and base depots to the Army-level and Corps-level dumps. The problem was that railways required infrastructure, tracks, bridges, marshalling yards, and that infrastructure was damaged by combat, by Allied bombing, and by German sabotage during their retreat. The Transportation Corps, whose engineers worked tirelessly to repair and restore railway capacity as the front advanced, was doing work that directly enabled ammunition supply. Every bridge they put back in operation, every stretch of track they relaid, multiplied the tonnage that could move forward, and reduced the load on the truck fleet. The relationship between rail capacity and truck requirement was direct and important. When rails worked, trucks could focus on the shorter forward hauls where they were irreplaceable. When rails were down, trucks had to cover the whole distance, and the system groaned under the strain. German demolitions complicated the railway restoration effort enormously. German engineers were skilled and systematic about destroying bridges and culverts during their retreats. They used explosives and, later in the campaign, a device specifically designed to tear up railroad track, destroying not just the rails but the ties and roadbed below. Allied engineers following behind had to assess each damaged section, determine what repairs were possible, and prioritize their work based on which lines offered the greatest forward capacity to the supply system. It was a race between German destruction and Allied restoration, and it was never fully won. There were always bottlenecks. There were always sections where the rails weren't ready and trucks had to carry the load. The pipeline system for fuel deserves a mention here because it illustrates how the Allies approached the problem of bulk supply generally. The Pluto pipeline under the ocean, carried fuel under the English Channel, and eventually through a network of pipes across France and Belgium. This removed fuel from the truck-hauled supply chain and freed truck capacity for other supplies, including ammunition. The pipeline system was extended as rapidly as possible to keep pace with the advance, with engineers laying pipe sections as fast as they could be produced and delivered. The concept was sound, and the execution, while not always as fast as planners wanted, significantly improved the fuel supply picture. Similar thinking about bulk supply infrastructure informed how ammunition-based depots were organized and how forward supply points were linked to them, though there was obviously no equivalent of a pipeline for shells. The ammunition itself was not always in perfect condition when it arrived at forward supply points. Rounds that had traveled by ship across the Atlantic, been unloaded at busy ports, stored in dumps under varying weather conditions, transported by rail and road over damaged infrastructure, and handled multiple times by different units, arrived at the gun line in varying states of preservation. Propellant charges could be affected by moisture. Shell casings could be damaged by rough handling. Fuses required inspection before use. Quality control in the field was a real function, and rounds that were found to be defective had to be segregated and reported. Using defective ammunition was potentially fatal, either through failure to function at the critical moment or through premature detonation. The ordnance units that inspected and managed ammunition quality were performing a function that directly affected the safety and effectiveness of the artillery they supported. Captured German ammunition was another variable in the supply equation. As Allied forces advanced and overran German positions, they frequently found ammunition dumps of all sizes, sometimes very large ones. The question of whether to use captured German artillery ammunition in Allied guns was complicated. German calibers didn't match Allied pieces in most cases, which meant captured artillery ammunition was largely useless unless you also had the German guns to fire it from. Occasionally, captured 88mm ammunition could be used in Allied anti-aircraft guns, but this required verification of the compatibility and condition of the rounds. More often, captured German ammunition was simply destroyed to prevent its recapture or use by other German forces. The destruction of large captured stocks had to be carried out carefully to avoid creating a hazard to surrounding troops, which sometimes meant time-consuming controlled demolitions rather than simple burning. The psychological dimension of working an ammunition supply under fire is something that doesn't appear in the official histories or the logistics reports, but it was real and it mattered. The men who worked in these positions weren't frontline infantry, and they weren't in a completely safe rear area. They occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They could hear the fighting. They knew what the stakes were. They saw the wounded being carried back. And they also knew that if the Germans found them, if a shell hit the wrong spot, the result would be catastrophic in a way that most military deaths were not. Working in proximity to large quantities of high explosive creates a specific awareness of consequence. An infantry soldier killed in action is one death. An ammunition supply point that detonates under fire can kill dozens and set off a chain of secondary explosions that kills dozens more. This wasn't paranoia, it was arithmetic. And the men who lived with that arithmetic, who did their jobs anyway, who followed their procedures and moved when they had to, and stayed when staying was required, showed a kind of courage that's harder to see but no less real than what was happening at the sharp end. Unit cohesion in logistics organizations was built on familiarity with procedures and trust in teammates under stress. A supply point moving at night under fire had to function as a team because the tasks were interdependent. The men loading trucks depended on the men counting inventory to tell them what was going where. The drivers depended on the people who knew the road to the new position. The security detachment depended on everyone else to move fast enough that the whole group didn't get caught in the open when the next salvo came in. This interdependence built a kind of institutional toughness in logistics units that got very little recognition, but was fundamental to how the system functioned. The Ruhr Pocket, that vast encirclement of German forces in April 1945, created a final large-scale logistical challenge. The operation required sustained artillery fire to compress the pocket and reduce its defenders. Supply points had to be positioned to support forces attacking from multiple directions toward a shrinking center. Movement was frequent as the perimeter shrank and fighting positions shifted. The Germans inside the pocket were still capable of resistance and still capable of fire, which meant that forward supply positions remained under threat, even in the final weeks of organized German resistance. Getting ammunition to the guns supporting the Ruhr reduction required the same constant vigilance and readiness to move that had characterized the whole campaign. The fact that the end was clearly near didn't make the rounds any lighter or the roads any safer. As Germany collapsed in the final weeks of the war, the ammunition supply system found itself in an almost surreal position. Stocks that had been carefully built up in anticipation of the final battles were in some cases larger than what the rapidly deteriorating resistance actually required. Ammunition supply points that had been positioned for hard fighting found themselves in areas where the fighting had simply evaporated, German units surrendering en masse before the guns were needed. The massive stocks that had been accumulated at such cost, in effort and organization and risk, were suddenly going to be left over. The transition from war to occupation, from supply to cessation, happened faster in some areas than even the most optimistic planners had anticipated. What does all of this add up to? What's the through line from the ammunition supply points on the beaches in June 1944 to the overstocked forward dumps sitting idle in the ruins of the Reich in May 1945? The through line is this: modern industrial warfare is a consumption problem at its heart. Armies don't win by being present. They win by maintaining the ability to apply force continuously and in the right place at the right time. That requires ammunition.